Welcome to Mythic Slumber, where forgotten texts become companions for rest. Tonight we descend into the limestone caves of Qumran, where shepherds once discovered fragments of parchment sealed in clay jars for nearly 2,000 years. Fragments that spoke of giants who walked the earth before the flood, of forbidden knowledge passed from heaven to humanity, and of dreams that foretold the end of the world. This is the story of the Book of Giants, a text lost for millennia, rediscovered in the silence of the Judean desert, pieced together word by word from scraps of leather and ink that crumbled at the slightest touch. We will wander through its broken narratives, linger in the spaces between missing lines, and follow the fading trail of a story older than empires, whispered by scribes who believed the world itself was young and fragile. Let your breath slow and your thoughts settle as we enter the dusty halls of this ancient, forbidden chronicle. If you enjoy drifting off to the legends of the ancient world, subscribing helps guide you back to these peaceful halls, and it supports the creation of more tranquil journeys into history. Now, let us turn our attention to the cliffs and caves where this mystery began, to the dry winds that swept across the shore of a dead sea, and to the moment when fragments of a lost world first saw light again after centuries of darkness. The discovery came not through scholars or expeditions, but through chance, through the wandering of a Bedouin shepherd in the spring of 1947, searching for a lost goat among the honeycomb cliffs that rise above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into one of the many cave mouths, expecting to hear the bleat of an animal, and instead heard the crack of breaking pottery, a sound that would echo through the study of ancient texts for generations to come. The caves of Qumran are not grand. They are narrow fissures in pale stone, carved by water and wind over ages beyond counting, chambers where bats roost and dust settles in undisturbed drifts. The shepherds who entered that first cave found tall clay jars, their mouths sealed with hardened pitch, their surfaces rough and unadorned. Inside these vessels, wrapped in linen as fine as spider silk, were scrolls of leather, some intact, many fragmentary, covered in columns of Hebrew and Aramaic script, so small and precise it seemed the work of patient ghosts. Among these texts were the familiar copies of the Torah, the Psalms, the words of the prophets, and among them were the unfamiliar, books mentioned in ancient lists but believed lost, books that spoke of angels who descended to earth, of giants born from unholy unions, and of secrets that were never meant to be written down. Over the following years, more caves were explored, more jars opened, more fragments gathered. Scholars arrived from Jerusalem, from Europe, from America, carrying magnifying glasses and cotton gloves, speaking in hushed voices as they arranged pieces of leather no larger than a fingernail on long tables under soft lamplight. The texts were catalogued, photographed, debated. Some were published quickly, others locked away for decades in climate-controlled vaults, their secrets guarded by academic disputes and political boundaries. Among the fragments eventually identified were portions of a text that had been known only by reputation, a book mentioned in ancient sources but never preserved in full, a companion to the Book of Enoch that told the story of the Nephilim from their own perspective, the voices of the giants themselves, speaking across the centuries in broken phrases and incomplete sentences. The Book of Giants, as scholars came to call it, was not a single manuscript, but a collection of fragments found in multiple caves, written in slightly different hands, copied and recopied by scribes who lived in the isolated community at Qumran during the last centuries before the Common Era. These scribes were Essenes, or so most believe, a sect of pious Jews who had withdrawn from the corruption of Jerusalem, from the politics of the temple, and the compromise with foreign powers, to live in the wilderness and prepare for the coming judgment of God. They kept strict laws, bathed in ritual pools carved into the bedrock, ate communal meals and spent their days copying sacred texts by the light that filtered through narrow windows. They believed themselves to be living in the final generation before the end of the age, and so they preserved what they considered essential: the Torah, the prophets, and also these other books that explained the origin of evil, the fall of angels, and the wickedness that had filled the earth before the great flood. The fragments of the Book of Giants are small, some no larger than a coin, others preserving only a few lines of text, words separated by lacunae, by gaps where the leather has rotted away or been eaten by insects over the long centuries. The ink is a dark brown, made from soot and gum, applied with a reed pen by hands that shook with age or cold, or the weight of what they were transcribing. The language is Aramaic, the common tongue of the Near East in those days, though some fragments contain Hebrew words, and others show influences from the languages of Persia and Babylon, echoes of the empires that had swept across this land and left their marks in vocabulary and syntax. To read these fragments is to read a puzzle with most of its pieces missing, to glimpse a story through a crack in a wall, to hear a voice speaking from a great distance, fading in and out like wind through empty halls. The narrative, as much as it can be reconstructed, begins not with the flood, but with what came before, with the time when humanity multiplied upon the earth, and angels looked down from their stations in the heavens and desired the daughters of men. This is the story told in the 6th chapter of Genesis, though there it is recounted in only 4 verses, a fragment of an older tradition compressed into a cryptic genealogy. The Book of Enoch expands this tale, naming the leaders of the fallen angels, describing their descent to Mount Hermon, recounting the oaths they swore to one another before committing their transgression. The Book of Giants takes the story further, focusing on the offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, giants in stature and strength, beings who are neither fully human nor fully divine, children of a boundary that should never have been crossed. The giants, according to the fragments, were not merely large but monstrous, towering over ordinary men by many cubits, their appetites vast and insatiable. They consumed the produce of the earth, devoured the flocks and herds, and when these were insufficient, they turned upon humanity itself, hunting men and drinking their blood, filling the world with violence and terror. The text names some of them Ohiah and Hahia, sons of the fallen angel Shemihaza, Mahaway, whose name means desire, and others whose names are lost in the gaps between fragments. These were not mindless brutes, but beings of intelligence and ambition, capable of speech, of planning, of dreams that troubled them in the darkness. They knew themselves to be unnatural, born of a union that defied the order established at creation, and this knowledge haunted them. The fragments describe how the giants began to have dreams, visions that came to them in sleep and filled them with dread. In one dream, a great tablet is brought forth, covered with writing, and a figure descends from heaven and erases all the names upon it, leaving only 3. In another, a garden full of trees is shown, and then angels descend with axes and cut down all but one tree, leaving it standing alone while the others fall and burn. The giants do not understand these dreams, but they sense their meaning. They are prophecies of destruction, warnings that their time upon the earth is short and that judgment is coming. They gather in council, these towering sons of fallen angels, and debate what should be done. Some propose sending a messenger to Enoch, the scribe who walks with God, to ask him to interpret their dreams and perhaps to intercede on their behalf. Others argue that it is too late, that the decree has already been issued, that nothing can turn aside the wrath that is gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Mahaway, the giant chosen as messenger, undertakes a journey across the earth to find Enoch. The fragments describe his flight, for he moves with supernatural speed, crossing mountains and deserts in a single day, until he comes to the place where Enoch dwells, a figure described as righteous and wise, a man who has been granted visions of heaven and knowledge of the future. Mahaway presents the dreams of the giants, and Enoch listens, his face grave, his eyes distant, as if seeing beyond the walls of the world. The interpretation, when it comes, is as the giants feared. The tablet represents the record of the living, and the erasure of names signifies death. The trees are the giants themselves, and the axes are the angels of destruction who will be sent to cut them down. The flood is coming, Enoch tells Mahaway, a deluge that will wash the earth clean of the corruption introduced by the Watchers and their offspring. Only a remnant will survive, only those whom God has chosen, and the giants are not among them. Mahaway returns with this message, flying across the wilderness as swiftly as he came, and delivers Enoch's words to the council of giants. The reaction is one of despair and defiance. Some accept their fate, resigning themselves to the inevitable, speaking of the crimes their fathers committed and acknowledging that justice requires their destruction. Others rage against the decree, cursing the angels who sired them and the God who now condemns them for sins they did not choose. The fragments break off here, leaving only scattered phrases, references to further dreams, to battles perhaps fought among the giants themselves, or against the angels sent to bind their fathers, to lamentations and final speeches whose words are lost in the crumbling margins of the parchment. The Book of Giants does not tell the story of the flood itself, for that is recounted elsewhere, in Genesis, in the Book of Enoch, in the traditions of a dozen cultures. It tells instead the story of those who knew the flood was coming and could do nothing to stop it, the final days of beings who stood between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. The discovery of these fragments at Qumran did more than add a lost book to the library of ancient texts. It confirmed that the stories of the Watchers and the Nephilim, which had been preserved in the Book of Enoch and other apocryphal writings, were not late inventions, but part of a living tradition in Second Temple Judaism, texts that were copied, studied, and revered by communities who saw in them explanations for the presence of evil in the world and the necessity of divine judgment. The scribes at Qumran did not view these stories as myth or metaphor, but as history, as accounts of real events that had shaped the moral landscape of creation. They lived in a world where angels were active participants in the unfolding of time, where the boundaries between heaven and earth were permeable, and where the choices made in distant ages continued to echo in the present. To read the Book of Giants was to remember why the world had once been destroyed, and to prepare for the day when it might be destroyed again, when the wicked would be swept away, and only the righteous would remain to inherit a renewed creation. The story of the Watchers, as preserved in the fragmentary texts from Qumran and in the more complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch found in Ethiopia, begins in the heavens themselves, in the courts where angels stood before the throne of God and carried out the work of creation and governance. These beings were not the winged cherubim of later artistic tradition, but entities of pure intellect and will, stationed at various levels of the celestial hierarchy, each with assigned duties in the maintenance of cosmic order. Some tended the movements of stars, others recorded the deeds of humanity, still others carried messages between the divine realm and the world below. They were called Watchers because that was their function: to observe, to guard, to ensure that the boundaries established at creation remained intact. They looked down upon the earth from heights beyond measurement, and for uncounted ages they performed their tasks without question or complaint, eternal servants in an eternal rhythm. In the days when humanity began to multiply upon the face of the earth, spreading from the valley between the rivers into distant lands, building cities of mud, brick and stone, developing languages and crafts, and the first glimmerings of what would later be called civilization, the Watchers continued their vigil. They saw the fields being planted, the herds being tended, the children being born and growing and dying in the natural cycle ordained for mortal creatures. Among these humans were daughters of particular beauty, women whose forms and faces caught the light in ways that stirred something unexpected in the beings who observed from above. The fragments do not explain how immortal spirits could experience desire, how beings without flesh could covet what was made of dust. But they record that it happened, that a corruption entered the ranks of the Watchers like a crack spreading through ancient stone. What began as observation became longing, and longing became resolve, and resolve became conspiracy. The leader of this rebellion was named Shemihaza, and the fragments preserve his name with a kind of dark reverence, speaking of him as both mighty and doomed. He was not alone in his desire, for 200 Watchers joined in the plot, but he was chief among them, the one who first voiced what others had only thought, who proposed that they descend together to the daughters of men and take them as wives. The other angels hesitated, for they understood that such an act would constitute a fundamental violation, a crossing of the boundary between heaven and earth that had been established at the beginning of all things. Shemihaza himself feared that he alone would bear the punishment for such a transgression, that the others would lose their courage and leave him to face divine wrath in isolation. So he proposed an oath, a binding sworn upon Mount Hermon in the land of Bashan, a peak whose name means sacred or forbidden, where all 200 angels would pledge themselves to the deed together, accepting mutual guilt and mutual consequence. The mountain rises in the north, its summit white with snow even in summer, visible from great distances across the plains of Syria and the valleys of Lebanon. It was there, according to the tradition preserved in these ancient texts, that the Watchers gathered and swore their terrible oath, binding themselves not only to the act of descent, but to one another, forming a brotherhood of the fallen. They took a vow that none would turn back, that all would descend together and share whatever fate resulted from their choice. The fragments list the names of the chiefs among them, Shemihaza and Azazel, Arachiel and Ramiel, Kokabiel and Tamiel, Asael and Armes, and others whose names are broken in the lacunae or rendered uncertain by damaged script. Each name carried meaning in the Aramaic and Hebrew tongues, often incorporating the name of God, a bitter irony that these beings who bore the divine name in their own identities would be the ones to defile the order they were meant to preserve. They descended in the days of Jared, whose name means descent, a detail preserved in Genesis as a genealogical marker, but understood by the authors of these apocryphal texts as a chronological anchor, a way of placing the rebellion in the sequence of antediluvian generations. The Watchers came down upon Mount Hermon, manifesting in forms that could interact with the physical world, taking on flesh or the semblance of flesh, making themselves visible and tangible to human perception. They scattered across the earth, each seeking out the women they desired, and took them without consent or ceremony, without regard for existing bonds or the natural order of human kinship. From these unions children were born, and from the moment of their birth it was clear that they were not ordinary human offspring, but something new and terrible, beings who grew with unnatural speed, reaching the height of giants while still in their youth, their appetites and strength exceeding anything the world had yet known. The fragments describe the stature of these giants in terms that strain credibility, speaking of beings 300 cubits tall, or in some versions 3,000, numbers that may be corrupted in transmission, or may represent attempts to convey through hyperbole the monstrous nature of these creatures. Even if the actual measurements were more modest, the tradition is consistent that the Nephilim towered over ordinary humans, that their presence on the earth was an intrusion of something that did not belong, a category violation that manifested in physical form. Their bodies were strong, capable of feats no human could match, able to uproot trees, to move stones that required teams of oxen, to hunt the largest beasts without weapons. They ate constantly, consuming the harvests of entire regions, devouring flocks and herds until the resources of the land were depleted. When the produce of agriculture and husbandry no longer sufficed, they began to hunt humans, treating them as game, as food, filling the earth with violence and terror. The corruption introduced by the Watchers was not limited to the physical presence of the giants. The fallen angels themselves taught humanity knowledge that was meant to remain hidden, skills and secrets that would accelerate the development of civilization in dangerous directions. Azazel, according to the fragments and the fuller account in the Book of Enoch, taught men the art of metalworking, showing them how to forge swords and knives, spears and armor, weapons that would make warfare more efficient and more deadly. He also taught women the use of cosmetics and jewelry, the arts of beautification that would increase vanity and lust. Other Watchers taught astrology and the observation of celestial signs, enchantments, and the cutting of roots for magical purposes, the interpretation of omens, and the summoning of spirits. Each of these teachings, in the framework of these ancient texts, represented a theft of divine knowledge, a premature revelation of secrets that humanity was not ready to receive, that would be used not for good, but for oppression and destruction. The world before the flood, as imagined in these texts, was a place of advanced but corrupt civilization, where cities rose tall and proud, where metals gleamed in the sunlight, where women adorned themselves with precious stones, and men carried bronze blades, where priests read the stars, and magicians spoke with unseen powers. It was also a world descending into chaos, where the strong preyed upon the weak without restraint, where the giants ruled as tyrants over human populations, where the natural order of creation had been so thoroughly disrupted that the earth itself cried out for relief. The fragments speak of blood soaking into the ground, of the soil refusing to yield its crops because it had been polluted by violence, of the spirits of slain humans rising as accusations before the throne of heaven. This is the context in which the decree of destruction was issued, not as arbitrary divine wrath, but as necessary judgment, the only way to cleanse a creation that had been fundamentally corrupted at its root. Among the giants themselves, there emerged a hierarchy and a culture, fragmentary though our knowledge of it remains. They were not mindless monsters, but beings capable of language and thought, of forming alliances and rivalries, of experiencing fear and pride. The text names several of them individually, suggesting that they had distinct identities and roles within their community. Ohia and Hahia, the sons of Shemihaza, appear most frequently in the surviving fragments, often acting as representatives of the giants in their attempts to understand their fate. Mahaway, whose role as messenger to Enoch has already been mentioned, seems to have been regarded as wise or at least prudent among his kind. There are hints of other giants with different temperaments and responses to their situation, some accepting responsibility for the violence they had committed, others defiant until the end, insisting that they were victims of circumstances beyond their control, offspring who had not chosen their parentage or their nature. The giants lived, according to these accounts, for several generations before the flood, long enough to establish themselves as the dominant force on earth, long enough to fill the world with their offspring and their works. They built structures the fragments suggest, though whether these were cities or fortresses or monuments is unclear from the damaged text. They made war upon one another as well as upon humanity, driven by rivalries and competition for resources, for territory, for dominance. The earth became a battlefield, and ordinary humans were caught between the warring factions of beings far more powerful than themselves, reduced to servitude or prey. their cries for deliverance rising like smoke from burning offerings. In the heavens, the angels who had remained faithful witnessed this devastation and brought reports before God, describing the bloodshed, the corruption, the complete breakdown of the order that had been established at creation. It was in this context that the dreams began to trouble the giants, visions that came in the darkness and would not be shaken off upon waking. The fragments preserve several of these dreams in varying degrees of completeness, each one a symbolic representation of coming judgment. In one, a tablet of destiny is brought forth and wiped clean, leaving only a few names, a vision of erasure and extinction. In another, a vast garden is shown, full of trees representing the giants, and celestial beings descend with implements of destruction, cutting down all but a single tree, leaving it standing alone in a field of stumps and ashes. In yet another dream, preserved only in tantalizing fragments, there are references to water and darkness, to the heavens opening and the foundations of the earth breaking apart, clear foreshadowing of the deluge that was to come. The giants gathered to discuss these visions, troubled by their consistency and their obvious portent, seeking interpretation from those among them who claimed wisdom or prophetic insight. The decision to send Mahaway to Enoch represented a final attempt to understand and perhaps to avert their fate, an acknowledgement that despite their strength and their divine parentage, the giants remained subject to powers greater than themselves. Enoch, the seventh from Adam in the antediluvian genealogy, was revered as a righteous man who walked with God, who had been granted visions of heaven and understanding of divine mysteries. The Book of Enoch, which circulated alongside the Book of Giants in the Qumran library, describes his journeys through the celestial realms, his visions of the throne of God, his role as scribe and witness. To the giants, he represented the only possible intermediary, a human who had access to divine knowledge, who might be able to interpret their dreams and perhaps to intercede on their behalf, to plead for mercy, or at least for understanding. Mahaway's journey across the earth to find this prophet was undertaken with urgency, for the dreams were becoming more frequent and more terrifying, and the sense of impending doom was growing among the giants like shadows lengthening before sunset. When Mahaway found Enoch, the encounter was recorded in fragments so damaged that entire sentences are lost, leaving only scattered words and broken phrases from which the scene must be reconstructed. The journey itself had been miraculous, for Mahaway travelled with the speed granted by his supernatural heritage, crossing mountains and rivers in a day, arriving at a place described only as the dwelling of the scribe, a location that may have been physical or may have existed in some liminal space between earth and heaven. Enoch received him, the fragments suggest, not with fear but with a kind of sad foreknowledge, as though he had been expecting this visitation, as though he already knew what message the giant had come to deliver and what interpretation he would be required to give. The text preserves a formal quality to their exchange, a ritual courtesy between beings from different orders of existence, the giant son of a fallen angel and the human prophet who walked with God. Mahaway presented the dreams that had troubled the giants, recounting them with precision, describing the tablet wiped clean, the garden of trees cut down, the symbols of destruction and erasure. He asked, according to the fragmentary narrative, whether these visions might mean something other than what they seemed to portend, whether there might be some way to avert the judgment they appeared to announce. Enoch listened in silence, the text suggests, perhaps consulting his own visions or simply reflecting on knowledge already granted to him by divine revelation. His response when it came was delivered not with anger or satisfaction, but with the grave sorrow of one who must speak a truth that offers no comfort, who must confirm fears rather than allay them. The dreams, Enoch explained, were indeed prophecies, sent not to warn so that the danger might be avoided, but to announce what had already been decreed, to prepare the giants for an end that could not be turned aside. The interpretation, as preserved in the fragments, was unambiguous in its message, though poetic in its language. The tablet represented the book of the living, the record kept in heaven of all who walk the earth, and the erasure of names signified death on a massive scale, the wiping away of an entire generation. The trees in the garden were the giants themselves, each one representing a life, a lineage, a presence on the earth, and the cutting down of the trees was the work of the angels of destruction who would be sent to execute divine judgment. Only one tree was left standing in the vision, and this, Enoch explained, represented the remnant that would survive, the line of Noah through whom humanity would be preserved and renewed after the cleansing of the flood. For the giants there would be no such preservation, no ark to shelter them, no continuation beyond the coming catastrophe. They were, by their very nature, a corruption that had to be removed, offspring of a union that should never have occurred, and their extinction was necessary for the restoration of creation's proper order. The fragments preserve additional details of Enoch's response, though these are among the most damaged portions of the text, with entire lines missing and only occasional words surviving to hint at what was said. There are references to the crimes of the Watchers, to the forbidden knowledge they had taught, to the violence that had filled the earth because of their offspring. There are mentions of the cries of humanity reaching heaven, of blood calling out from the ground for justice, of the earth itself groaning under the weight of corruption and pleading for relief. Enoch spoke, it seems, not only of the judgment to come, but of its necessity, of why the flood could not be avoided, why mercy in this case would be no mercy at all, but would only prolong suffering and allow evil to spread until it consumed everything. His words were a kind of theodicy, a justification of divine action that acknowledged the tragedy while insisting on the righteousness of the decree. Enoch also delivered, according to the fragments, a message for the Watchers themselves, the fallen angels who had sired the giants and who had taught humanity the forbidden arts. This message was one of condemnation and binding, a declaration that they would not be permitted to ascend back to heaven, that they would be imprisoned until the day of final judgment, bound in darkness beneath the earth where they would await their ultimate fate. The Book of Enoch, in its more complete Ethiopian version, describes this binding in detail, telling how the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel were dispatched to carry out the sentence, how they descended to earth with chains and implements of restraint, how they hunted down the leaders of the rebellion and cast them into pits and chasms from which there would be no escape. The Book of Giants alludes to this same event, though the surviving fragments do not provide the narrative in full, leaving only references to the binding, to the separation of fathers from sons, to the isolation of the Watchers in their punishment. Mahaway received this interpretation and this message with what the text describes as great sorrow, though whether this sorrow was for himself and his fellow giants, or for the condemned Watchers, or for the world that was about to be destroyed, is not entirely clear from the damaged parchment. He departed from Enoch's presence with the speed he had come, flying back across the wilderness to the place where the giants had gathered, carrying news that would confirm their worst fears and extinguish whatever hope they had maintained that the dreams might mean something less final. The journey back is described in even more fragmentary terms than the journey out, with only scattered phrases suggesting his route and his state of mind, words that speak of darkness and haste, of the weight of knowledge, of the loneliness of being a messenger bearing tidings of doom. When Mahaway delivered Enoch's interpretation to the assembled giants, their reactions varied according to temperament and understanding. Some received the news with resignation, accepting that they had been born into a world that had no place for them, that their existence was itself a violation of cosmic order, that death, when it came, would not be unjust but would be the correction of an error that should never have been made. These giants spoke, the fragments suggest, of the crimes their fathers had committed, acknowledging that the Watchers had acted out of desire rather than duty, that the knowledge they had taught had been used for evil, that the violence of the giants themselves had made the earth uninhabitable for ordinary humans. They did not plead for mercy because they understood that mercy had already been extended to humanity in the form of Noah, that the preservation of a remnant was itself an act of divine grace, and that their own destruction was the price required for that preservation. Other giants responded with anger and defiance, refusing to accept responsibility for circumstances they had not chosen, arguing that they had not asked to be born, that their nature had been determined by the actions of their fathers, that it was unjust to punish offspring for the sins of their progenitors. These voices, preserved in fragmentary speeches that break off mid-sentence or resume without context, cursed the watchers for their weakness and lust, cursed the God who had created the order they had violated, cursed Enoch for delivering a message without intercession, for interpreting dreams without offering hope. The fragments record accusations and lamentations, questions about divine justice and the nature of guilt, philosophical wrestling with the problem of inherited corruption and the limits of free will. These are not simple narratives but complex theological reflections, indications that the authors of these texts were using the story of the giants to explore questions about responsibility, punishment, and the relationship between nature and choice. Among the most intriguing fragments are those that describe further dreams experienced by the giants after Mahaway's return, visions that came in the final period before the flood, when the judgment was imminent and the sky itself seemed to darken with approaching catastrophe. One fragment, tantalizingly brief, describes a dream in which the sun grew dark and the earth shook, a vision of cosmic upheaval that mirrored the chaos to come. Another fragment, even more damaged, contains references to heavenly tablets being read aloud, to names being called out and then crossed away, to account being taken of the living and the dead. There are hints of dreams in which the giants saw themselves drowning, struggling in rising waters, calling out for help that did not come. Visions so disturbing that some who experienced them refused to sleep, keeping themselves awake through the nights in fear of what they might see when they closed their eyes. The fragments also preserve glimpses of the giants' final days, though these passages are among the most difficult to interpret because of the extensive damage to the manuscripts. There are references to gatherings and councils, to debates about whether to fight or to flee, to arguments about where one might go to escape a judgment decreed from heaven. Some giants, it appears, proposed ascending to the heights of mountains, reasoning that the waters, if they came, might not reach the tallest peaks. Others suggested descending into deep caves or building great towers, structures that might rise above the flood or shelter them until the waters receded. All of these plans were, of course, futile, born of desperation rather than genuine hope, the scrambling of condemned beings who knew in their hearts that no earthly refuge could save them from a divine sentence, but could not stop themselves from trying to survive. There are also fragments that describe conflicts among the giants themselves in these final days, violence born of fear and frustration, battles fought not against external enemies, but between members of their own community. The reasons for these conflicts are not clear from the surviving text, but they may have arisen from disputes about resources, from accusations and counter-accusations about responsibility for their predicament, from the breakdown of social order that often accompanies impending catastrophe. The giants, who had once united in their domination of humanity, now turned on one another. Their last days marked not by dignity or solidarity, but by the same violence and chaos they had inflicted on the world around them. In this, the fragments suggest, they demonstrated that the corruption was not merely external, not simply a matter of their unnatural birth, but internal, woven into their very being, manifesting in their choices and actions even as the end approached. The binding of the watchers is mentioned in several fragments, though never described in the kind of detail provided in the Book of Enoch. The giants watched, it seems, as their fathers were hunted down and imprisoned, as the angels who had descended to earth in desire and pride were dragged away in chains, their powers stripped, their forms diminished, their voices silenced. Some fragments suggest that certain giants attempted to defend their fathers, engaging in combat with the angels sent to execute the binding. Battles that were brief and one-sided, for no matter how strong the giants were in physical terms, they could not stand against beings acting under direct divine authority, wielding weapons forged in heavenly fire. The defeat of these defenders was total, their bodies left broken on the ground, their sacrifice meaningless in the face of a judgment that could not be resisted. As the watchers were led away to their imprisonment, some fragments record their final words to their offspring, though these passages are so damaged that only phrases survive, scattered words of regret or defiance, of warning or farewell. One fragment preserves what appears to be a father's attempt to comfort his giant son, assuring him that death is not the end, that some part of them will endure, though whether this refers to a continuation of consciousness or merely to memory is unclear. Another fragment contains what seems to be a curse, a watcher calling down vengeance on those who had imprisoned him, declaring that even from the depths of the earth he would find ways to corrupt and destroy, to influence the world through whispers and temptations. These final exchanges between fathers and sons, between the condemned and the about to be destroyed, add a tragic dimension to the narrative, humanizing beings who might otherwise appear as purely monstrous, showing that even in corruption there can be love, even in rebellion there can be grief. The fragments become increasingly sparse and disjointed as the narrative approaches the flood itself, with entire sections missing or reduced to single words scattered across damaged parchment. There are references to signs in the sky, to changes in the weather, to animals behaving strangely as if they sense the coming catastrophe. There are mentions of Noah and his family, though the giants' knowledge of them seems limited, distant observations of the construction of the ark perhaps, or rumours of a righteous man being spared. The text does not describe the flood from the perspective of those who survived it, but from the perspective of those who did not, and as the waters began to rise, the fragments that might have recorded the giants' final moments are lost, leaving only silence, the white space on the parchment where words once stood but have crumbled into dust, leaving readers to imagine the end that the ancient scribes described. But that time has erased from the historical record. The scribes who copied the Book of Giants at Qumran worked in a world very different from our own, a world where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were understood to be thin and permeable, where angels and demons moved through creation with purpose and agency, where the history of the world was not merely a sequence of human events, but a cosmic drama involving multiple levels of reality and multiple orders of beings. To understand why they preserved these fragmentary stories of giants and fallen angels, why they considered such texts worthy of the precious parchment and the countless hours required for careful transcription, we must enter into their cosmology, their way of seeing creation, and its ongoing struggle between forces of light and forces of darkness, between the divine order established at the beginning and the chaos that continually threatened to overwhelm it. The community at Qumran saw themselves as living in the last days, the final generation before God would intervene in history to judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous. They had withdrawn from mainstream Jewish society, which they viewed as corrupted by false priests and political compromise, and had established their settlement in the wilderness beside the Dead Sea, a landscape as harsh and unforgiving as their theology. The cliffs behind them rose in pale limestone walls, their surfaces marked by erosion into patterns that resembled writing, as if the rock itself bore witness to ancient truths. The sea before them lay still and heavy, its waters so dense with salt that nothing could live in them, a kind of death held in suspension, a reminder of Sodom and Gomorrah, and other places where divine judgment had fallen in ages past. Here, in this margin between desert and dead water, the Essenes built their community, their ritual baths, their scriptorium, their common meals, preparing themselves for the end of the age. In their understanding, the present evil of the world had its origin in the primordial rebellion described in the Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch, the descent of the Watchers, and the corruption they introduced through their offspring and their teachings. This was not mythology to them, but history, an account of how evil had entered creation, why humanity was prone to violence and wickedness, why the world required purification through divine judgment. The story of the flood was the first such purification, the destruction of the giants and the imprisonment of the Watchers who had sired them. But it was not the final one. The evil had not been completely eradicated, for the spirits of the slain giants continued to roam the earth as demons, and the imprisoned Watchers still exerted influence through their whisperings from the depths. The world that emerged after the flood was cleaner than what had come before, but it was not clean, and over the generations, corruption had crept back in, requiring a second and final judgment, one that the Qumran community believed was imminent. The fragments of the Book of Giants were copied and studied alongside other texts that formed a coherent library of apocalyptic literature, writings that revealed hidden knowledge about the structure of the cosmos, the nature of angels and demons, the coming judgment, and the role of the righteous remnant in the divine plan. The Book of Enoch, of which multiple copies were found at Qumran, described in elaborate detail the rebellion of the Watchers, the journeys of Enoch through the heavenly realms, the punishment awaiting the wicked, and the eventual establishment of a new heaven and new earth. The Book of Jubilees, another text preserved in the caves, retold the narratives of Genesis with additional details and interpretations, organizing history into periods of 49 years, cosmic weeks that measured the unfolding of divine purpose. The Damascus document and the war scroll, composed by the community itself, described the battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a conflict both spiritual and physical that would culminate in the final victory of God's chosen ones. In this literary context, the Book of Giants served a specific function, providing a window into the consciousness of the condemned, showing the world from the perspective of beings who knew they were doomed, who experienced the terror of dreams that foretold their destruction, who wrestled with questions of guilt and innocence even as the waters rose around them. The text was not merely a historical record, but a warning and a teaching tool, demonstrating the consequences of transgressing divine boundaries, showing that even beings of supernatural strength and divine parentage could not escape the judgment decreed against them. For a community that saw itself as separate and pure, surrounded by a corrupt world, the story of the giants reinforced the necessity of maintaining boundaries, of not mixing with those outside the covenant, of keeping themselves undefiled until the day when God would act to separate the righteous from the wicked permanently. The influence of older mythologies can be traced in the layers of the Book of Giants, echoes of Mesopotamian traditions about divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity the arts of civilization. In the ancient Sumerian king list, there are rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods before a great flood divided history into before and after. And among the Babylonian myths there are stories of the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea and brought wisdom to humanity, figures who share certain characteristics with the Watchers despite the differences in detail and interpretation. The Jewish authors who shaped these traditions into their present form were not simply borrowing foreign myths, but were reinterpreting them through the lens of monotheism, transforming what had been positive culture heroes in the Mesopotamian accounts into rebels against the one true God, turning stories of progress and enlightenment into narratives of forbidden knowledge and transgression. The Persian influence on Second Temple Judaism is also evident in these texts, particularly in their dualistic framework, the sharp division between light and darkness, good and evil, the righteous and the wicked. During the Babylonian exile and the subsequent Persian period, when Jews lived under the rule of empires that had their own complex theologies and cosmologies, there was a cross-pollination of ideas, a borrowing and adaptation that enriched Jewish thought while maintaining its distinctive monotheistic core. The concept of a cosmic battle between opposing forces, so central to Zoroastrianism, found expression in Jewish apocalyptic literature, though always subordinated to the absolute sovereignty of God, who remained the ultimate authority over both angels and demons, who had created the order that the Watchers violated, and who would restore that order through judgment and renewal. The fragments of the Book of Giants, when examined closely, reveal the work of multiple hands and multiple stages of composition. Some sections are written in a more elevated, poetic style, with formal structures and rhythmic patterns that suggest they may have been intended for liturgical use or for recitation in communal settings. Other sections are more prosaic, straightforward narration of events without literary embellishment, suggesting a different author or a different purpose. There are inconsistencies in details, names that appear in variant forms, numbers that do not quite match across different fragments, all the usual signs of a text that developed over time, that was copied and recopied, that incorporated material from multiple sources and traditions. The scribes at Qumran did not see these variations as problems to be corrected, but as aspects of a living tradition, a body of sacred literature that bore the marks of its transmission across generations and communities. The physical manuscripts themselves, as they were discovered in the caves, bore witness to the care with which they had been preserved and the violence with which they had been hidden. The jars that contained them had been sealed in haste, perhaps when the community learned that Roman forces were approaching. When it became clear that Qumran would not survive the war that was consuming Judea in the years leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. The scrolls were wrapped in linen, some of them placed in multiple layers of protection, then lowered into jars and sealed with pitch, then carried into the caves and left in niches and crevices where they would remain undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. The scribes who performed this final act of preservation could not have known that their library would survive into an age when Jerusalem lay in ruins, when the temple they had refused to worship in had been burned and torn down, when their own community had been scattered or killed, and their settlement left to crumble in the desert sun. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of Qumran in the decades following the discovery of the scrolls, they found the remains of the scriptorium where the copying had been done, a long room with plastered benches along the walls, narrow tables where parchment could be stretched and inked, small inkwells made of clay, some still containing dried residue of the carbon-based ink used for writing. They found the ritual baths where the scribes had purified themselves before handling sacred texts, stepped pools carved into the bedrock and fed by an elaborate system of channels that brought water from the winter rains. They found the remains of the common dining hall, the pottery workshop, the tower that may have served as a watchtower or a place for astronomical observation, all the physical infrastructure of a community that had organized every aspect of life around the study of Scripture and preparation for divine judgment. The pottery found at the site was simple and functional, mostly plain clay vessels for storage and eating, with none of the decorative elements that characterized pottery from wealthier settlements. The absence of luxury items, the communal nature of the facilities, the careful organization of space for religious observance all pointed to a group that had embraced voluntary poverty and communal living, that had rejected the values of the wider society in favor of a radical commitment to purity and holiness. They owned property in common, shared meals prepared according to strict ritual requirements, wore simple clothing, and spent their days in prayer, study, and manual labor. Their lives were governed by a detailed rule of discipline, fragments of which were found among the scrolls, specifying penalties for various infractions, procedures for admission of new members, protocols for community decision-making, a legal framework for a society that saw itself as a new Israel, a faithful remnant maintaining the covenant while the rest of the nation strayed. The scribes who copied the Book of Giants were part of this community, men who had devoted years to learning the sacred languages, mastering the scripts, developing the steady hand and patient concentration required to produce clean, legible copies of precious texts. They worked in silence, or in the murmur of quiet conversation, one scribe reading aloud while others transcribed, checking their work against the exemplar, correcting errors, noting uncertainties with marks in the margins. The process was slow and demanding, requiring complete concentration, for a single mistake could corrupt the text for future generations, could introduce errors that would be perpetuated in subsequent copies. The responsibility was spiritual as much as technical, for they understood themselves to be preserving divine revelation, maintaining the integrity of sacred traditions that reached back through the centuries to the patriarchs and prophets. The choice to copy and preserve the Book of Giants, alongside more obviously canonical texts like the Torah and the prophets, reflected the community's conviction that this story was essential to understanding the human condition, the origin of evil, and the necessity of the coming judgment. They read these fragments about the dreams of doomed giants and saw in them their own situation, a righteous few standing against a corrupt world, awaiting deliverance that would come through destruction and renewal. The giants had been warnings to their fathers, and the story of the giants was a warning to the present generation, a reminder that no matter how powerful the wicked might seem, no matter how thoroughly they might dominate the earth, their time was limited, their destruction certain, their fate already written on the heavenly tablets that Enoch had seen in his visions, and that would be opened when the day of judgment arrived. In the darkness of the caves where the scrolls waited through the centuries, the words of the Book of Giants rested in silence, the ink fading slowly on parchment that grew brittle with time, the fragments breaking along the creases where they had been folded, the edges crumbling where they had been exposed to moisture, or touched by curious hands in that last desperate effort to hide them from approaching enemies. The jars stood sealed and forgotten while empires rose and fell outside, while Christianity spread across the world carrying some of these same stories in modified forms. While Rabbinic Judaism developed in the absence of the temple and chose not to preserve these apocalyptic texts in its canonical literature, preferring to focus on law and interpretation rather than on visions of cosmic warfare and angelic rebellion. The Book of Giants became a lost text, known only from references in other ancient writings, until the day a shepherd's stone cracked open the silence and brought the fragments back into light. The work of reconstructing the Book of Giants from the fragments found at Qumran required decades of patient scholarship, the slow assembly of a puzzle for which most pieces were missing and for which no complete picture had ever been seen. The initial discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 was followed by years of excavation, as cave after cave yielded its hidden treasures, jars full of parchment that had to be carefully extracted, transported to laboratories, unrolled with instruments fine as surgical tools, photographed under controlled lighting, catalogued and numbered, and stored in conditions that would prevent further deterioration. The scholars who undertook this work came from different countries and traditions, bringing their expertise in ancient languages, in textual criticism, in the history of Second Temple Judaism, in the comparison of manuscripts, and the identification of scribal hands. In the early years after the discovery, access to the scrolls was restricted to a small team of researchers, men who worked in Jerusalem examining the fragments under magnifying lamps, comparing different pieces to determine which belonged to the same manuscript, attempting to match the torn edges like fitting together shards of broken pottery. The process was complicated by the fact that many scrolls had disintegrated into hundreds or even thousands of pieces, some no larger than a fingernail, all mixed together in the jars or scattered on the cave floors where they had fallen when the leather rotted and the stitching that held the sheets together dissolved. A single manuscript might be distributed across multiple caves, with fragments of the same text appearing in different contexts, requiring careful comparison of handwriting, parchment quality, and content to determine that they were parts of the same original work. The identification of the Book of Giants among the fragments was not immediate. The initial focus was on the more complete scrolls and on texts that were clearly biblical or that related to the community's own rules and practices. Only gradually, as scholars worked through the vast collection of fragmentary material, did certain pieces begin to coalesce into patterns suggesting a narrative about giants and their fate. The breakthrough came when researchers recognized the connection between certain Aramaic fragments from Qumran and a text that had been known for centuries in a completely different context, a Manichaean version of the Book of Giants preserved in Middle Persian and other Central Asian languages, discovered in the oasis cities of the Silk Road in the early 20th century by expeditions from Europe and Japan. Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century of the Common Era in Mesopotamia, had been a major world religion for several centuries, spreading from the Mediterranean to China before being suppressed by Christian, Muslim, and Chinese authorities and fading into obscurity. Among the sacred texts of the Manichaeans were works attributed to Mani himself and others drawn from earlier traditions, adapted to fit the Manichaean cosmology with its elaborate mythology of light and darkness, its complex hierarchies of divine and demonic beings. One of these texts was a version of the Book of Giants, though in the Manichaean recension it had been significantly altered, with new characters introduced, including Mani himself as a kind of narrator or interpreter, and with the story integrated into the larger Manichaean narrative of cosmic struggle and eventual redemption. When scholars compared the Manichaean fragments with the Aramaic pieces from Qumran, they found significant overlaps in vocabulary, in narrative structure, in the names of characters, enough to confirm that both were versions of the same underlying tradition, though separated by several centuries and filtered through very different theological frameworks. The Manichaean text, though fragmentary itself, was more complete in some sections than what had survived at Qumran, allowing scholars to fill in gaps, to understand the overall structure of the narrative, to identify which Qumran fragments belong to the Book of Giants rather than to the Book of Enoch or other related texts. This cross-cultural, cross-linguistic comparison represented a triumph of scholarly detective work, connecting dots across time and space, demonstrating how stories could travel and transform while retaining enough of their original shape to be recognizable centuries later. The reconstruction process involved not only the physical assembly of fragments, but also the interpretation of what survived, the attempt to understand narratives that were often cryptic even when complete, that assumed knowledge of broader traditions, that used symbolic language and elusive references that would have been clear to ancient readers, but that required extensive commentary for modern audiences. Scholars had to master not only Aramaic and Hebrew, but also the conventions of apocalyptic literature, the ways these texts signaled meaning through numerical symbolism, through coded references to contemporary events, through the reuse and reinterpretation of earlier biblical passages. They had to understand the worldview of Second Temple Judaism, its angelology and demonology, its concepts of purity and pollution, its expectations about divine intervention in history. The giants themselves, as they emerged from the fragments, were more complex figures than simple monsters or villains. They were portrayed with a degree of sympathy, as beings caught between worlds, neither fully divine nor fully human, aware of their own monstrosity but not entirely in control of it, victims of their father's transgression, even as they perpetuated violence and corruption through their own actions. The dreams that tormented them served as a kind of conscience, forcing them to confront what they were and what their fate would be, denying them the comfort of ignorance or the luxury of denial. In their consultations with one another, in their decision to send Mahaway to Enoch, in their reactions to the interpretation of their dreams, they displayed reasoning and emotion, fear and hope, the full range of responses that mark them as persons rather than mere forces of destruction. Some scholars interpreted the giants as representing foreign oppressors, the great empires that had dominated the Jewish people throughout their history, Babylon and Persia, Greece and Rome, powers that seemed invincible in their time, but that were destined to fall when divine judgment came. Others saw in the giants a representation of internal corruption within Israel itself, the apostate leaders and false priests who had violated the covenant and led the people astray, who would be swept away when God acted to purify the nation. Still others read the text as operating on multiple levels simultaneously, as both literal history of the antediluvian world and symbolic commentary on present circumstances, as both warning about cosmic dangers and allegory of human failings. The fragmentary nature of the text allowed for multiple interpretations, leaving space for readers to find in the story whatever resonated with their own situations and concerns. The process of publishing the fragments proceeded slowly, with detailed articles appearing in academic journals over the course of decades, each presenting a few more pieces of the puzzle, each offering new translations and interpretations, each generating debate and response from other scholars who disagreed with readings or arrangements or identifications. Photographs of the fragments were eventually made available to researchers around the world, allowing a broader community of scholars to participate in the work of reconstruction and interpretation, though this openness came only after considerable pressure from those who felt that the initial team had been too slow, too secretive, too possessive of materials that belonged to the common heritage of humanity. The scholarly politics surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls became almost as complex as the texts themselves, with disputes about access and authority, about methodology and interpretation, about who had the right to publish what and when. Through all these debates and delays, the fragments themselves remained constant. Pieces of ancient leather inscribed with ancient words, physical objects that could be measured and analysed, subjected to carbon dating and chemical analysis, examined for traces of the hands that had written them and the conditions under which they had been stored. The parchment was made from the skins of sheep or goats, prepared by soaking, scraping, stretching, and drying, then cut into sheets that were sewn together to form long rolls. The ink was made from lamp black, the soot collected from oil lamps, mixed with water and gum arabic to create a medium that would flow from the pen and adhere to the parchment surface. Under microscopic examination, scholars could see the individual fibers of the parchment, the way the ink had soaked into them, the variations in thickness that indicated where the scribe had paused to refill the pen or had pressed harder in concentration. Some fragments showed signs of having been read frequently, their surfaces worn smooth by handling, the ink faded in places where thumbs had rested, creases where the scroll had been rolled and unrolled many times. Others appeared almost pristine, as if they had been copied and then immediately stored away, preserved but not used, maintained as part of the library but not circulated for study. These variations suggested different roles for different copies within the community, some for liturgical use or communal study, others as reference copies or archival backups, insurance against the loss of a text through accident or wear. The care taken in preservation, the multiple copies of some works, the careful storage in jars, sealed against moisture and insects, all testified to a community that understood the fragility of written knowledge and took seriously the responsibility of maintaining it for future generations. The language of the fragments, Aramaic, was the common tongue of the Near East in the centuries before and after the beginning of the Common Era. The language Jesus would have spoken in daily conversation, the language in which much of the Talmud would eventually be written. It was related to Hebrew, sharing the same alphabet and much vocabulary, but with its own grammar and idioms, its own literary traditions. The Aramaic of the Book of Giants showed influences from different dialects and periods, suggesting that the text had been transmitted orally before being written down, or that it had been copied from earlier manuscripts that themselves drew on diverse sources. Certain phrases had a formulaic quality, patterns of repetition that suggested they had been memorized and recited, perhaps passed down through generations of storytellers before being fixed in writing. The names of the giants, when analysed philologically, revealed layers of meaning that enriched the narrative. Ohia, one of the most frequently mentioned, had a name that meant woe or alas, a designation of lamentation. Hahia, his brother, bore a name related to life or living, creating an ironic pairing between life and woe, between existence and suffering. Mahaway, the messenger, had a name that could be interpreted as desire or longing, appropriate for one who sought knowledge and understanding, who undertook the journey to Enoch in search of interpretation and perhaps hope. Other names were more obscure, their meanings lost or disputed, but all followed the pattern of Semitic nomenclature, combining elements to create words that were both identifiers and characterizations, names that told something about the bearer. The fragmentary preservation of the text created certain challenges for interpretation, but also offered certain insights that a complete manuscript might not have provided. The gaps in the narrative, the missing sections, forced readers to confront the reality of historical loss, the fact that most of the written heritage of ancient civilizations had vanished, that what survived was a tiny fraction of what had once existed, selected by accident and chance rather than by conscious curation. The fragments that remained were like windows into a lost world, offering glimpses but not panoramas, raising questions that could not be fully answered, preserving voices that spoke across the centuries, but in broken sentences, incomplete thoughts. This fragmentary quality became part of the meaning of the text, a reminder of mortality and transience, of the way even the mightiest works could crumble into dust, leaving only traces for later generations to puzzle over. As the 20th century progressed and gave way to the 21st, new technologies allowed for more sophisticated analysis of the fragments. Digital imaging could capture details invisible to the naked eye, revealing traces of letters that had faded almost completely, showing the layering of the parchment fibers in ways that help date the material and identify its origin. Computer databases allowed for rapid comparison of textual variations across multiple manuscripts, for the identification of patterns and parallels that would have taken lifetimes to discover through manual searching. DNA analysis of the parchment could determine which fragments came from the same animal hide, providing physical evidence for which pieces belong together, even when the text itself was too fragmentary to provide clear connections. Yet for all these technological advances, the fundamental work of reading and interpreting the fragments remained a human endeavor, requiring knowledge and imagination, patience and intuition, the ability to think oneself into an ancient mindset, to understand how scribes and readers 2,000 years ago would have approached these texts, what they would have found meaningful or frightening or hopeful in these stories of giants and judgment. The scholars who devoted their careers to this work were themselves participating in an act of transmission, carrying forward the tradition that the Qumran scribes had sought to preserve, ensuring that these voices from the past would continue to be heard even as the physical fragments continued their slow deterioration toward illegibility and dust. The Book of Giants cannot be understood in isolation, but must be read as part of a larger constellation of texts centered on the figure of Enoch and the mythology of the Watchers, a body of literature that circulated in multiple versions and languages throughout the ancient world, shaping theological imagination in Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam long after the original Hebrew and Aramaic compositions had been lost or suppressed. At the heart of this tradition stood the Book of Enoch, known to modern scholars as First Enoch, to distinguish it from later apocalypses attributed to the same patriarch, a composite work of 5 distinct sections that together presented a comprehensive vision of the antediluvian world, the rebellion of the angels, the coming judgment, and the ultimate restoration of creation. The Book of Giants was, in many ways, a companion text to First Enoch, filling in details about the offspring of the Watchers, giving voice to the giants themselves, exploring aspects of the story that First Enoch addressed only briefly or from other perspectives. The Book of Enoch itself was a substantial work, preserved complete only in the Ethiopian Church, which maintained it as canonical scripture when other branches of Christianity and Judaism had relegated it to the status of apocrypha or pseudepigrapha. The Ethiopian version, translated from Greek, which had been translated from Aramaic, represented the end point of a long chain of transmission, a text that had travelled through multiple languages and cultures, accumulating glosses and variations along the way, but retaining enough coherence to demonstrate that it derived from a unified literary tradition with deep roots in Second Temple Judaism. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran confirmed the antiquity of this tradition, showing that the Book of Enoch existed in something close to its present form at least 2 centuries before the Common Era, and suggesting that its origins might reach back even further into the Persian or even the Babylonian period. The opening section of First Enoch, known as the Book of the Watchers, narrated the descent of the angels and its consequences in detail that complemented and overlapped with the Book of Giants. It named the leaders of the rebellion, 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, listed the forbidden knowledge they taught to humanity, described the birth and violence of their giant offspring, and recounted how the cries of oppressed humanity reached heaven and prompted divine intervention. The archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel were dispatched to deal with the crisis, each assigned specific tasks in the execution of judgment. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel, the chief teacher of forbidden arts, and to cast him into darkness until the final judgment. Michael was commanded to bind Shemihaza and his confederates. Gabriel was sent to incite the giants to destroy one another through mutual warfare. And Uriel was commissioned to warn Noah of the coming flood and to instruct him in the building of the ark. The Book of the Watchers also contained extensive material about Enoch's journeys through the heavenly realms, his visions of the throne of God, his appointment as scribe and witness, his intercession on behalf of the bound watchers, and the rejection of that intercession. This material established Enoch's credentials as a prophet and revealer of divine secrets, explaining why he was the appropriate figure to interpret the giants' dreams in the Book of Giants, why his word carried authority, why his pronouncement of doom could not be questioned or appealed. The narrative structure positioned Enoch as a mediator figure, a human who had access to divine knowledge, who could move between earth and heaven, who understood both the human condition and the divine perspective, making him uniquely qualified to explain the meaning of events and to communicate God's decrees to those who would be affected by them. The theological function of the Watcher mythology, as developed in these texts, was to provide an explanation for the presence of evil in the world that did not compromise divine goodness or sovereignty. In the framework of strict monotheism, where there could be no rival deity, no cosmic principle of evil independent of God, The question of why a good creator would permit suffering and wickedness in creation required careful answering. The rebellion of the Watchers provided such an answer, locating the origin of evil not in God's creative act, but in the misuse of freedom by created beings, angels who chose to violate the boundaries assigned to them, who introduced corruption through their disobedience and through the knowledge they taught. Humanity was portrayed as victim rather than primary perpetrator, seduced and oppressed by supernatural forces, suffering under the tyranny of the giants and the influence of demonic teachings. This framework had important implications for how the community at Qumran and other groups influenced by this literature understood their own situation and their own struggles with sin and temptation. If evil had its origin in angelic rebellion and demonic influence, then human righteousness required not only moral effort, but also vigilance against spiritual enemies. The demons who had survived the flood as the disembodied spirits of the slain giants, who continued to lead humanity astray through whispered suggestions and false teachings. The Qumran community's emphasis on ritual purity, on maintaining strict boundaries between the holy and the profane, on avoiding contact with those outside the covenant, all reflected this understanding of the world as a battleground where spiritual forces were constantly at work, where the righteous few stood against overwhelming opposition, protected only by divine favor and their own unwavering commitment to the law. The mythology of the Watchers also addressed questions about the diversity of human knowledge and culture, explaining the origins of technologies and practices that were morally ambiguous or potentially dangerous. Metalworking, which produced both agricultural tools and weapons of war, was traced to the teaching of Azazel. Cosmetics and jewelry, which enhanced beauty but could also incite lust and vanity, were likewise attributed to the fallen angels. Astrology, magic, and divination, practices that provided knowledge of hidden things but that could lead to idolatry and trafficking with demons, all derived from the forbidden teachings given by the Watchers. This etiological function, explaining where things came from, carried with it a moral evaluation, suggesting that not all knowledge was beneficial, that some information was better left unknown, that the pursuit of certain forms of understanding could lead to corruption and destruction rather than to wisdom and flourishing. The Book of Giants, in focusing on the dreams of the giants and their interpretation by Enoch, emphasized the theme of prophetic knowledge, the ability to see the future and to understand the meaning of symbolic visions. Dreams in ancient Near Eastern culture were not mere psychological phenomena, but potential vehicles of divine communication, messages that required interpretation by those with special gifts or training. The giants' dreams were troubling precisely because they sensed their significance without being able to grasp their meaning, much as the biblical Pharaoh was disturbed by dreams of fat and lean cattle, of healthy and withered grain, until Joseph revealed their interpretation. The consultation with Enoch paralleled other biblical scenes of dream interpretation, but with the crucial difference that the message delivered was one of doom rather than deliverance, a prophecy that offered no escape, no action that could avert the coming catastrophe. The relationship between the Book of Giants and the broader Enochic tradition extended beyond First Enoch to include other works attributed to the antediluvian patriarch. The Book of Jubilees, which retold the Genesis narratives with additional details and chronological precision, incorporated elements of the Watcher mythology, describing how the angels descended, how the giants corrupted the earth, and how Noah was warned of the flood. It also developed the tradition about the spirits of the slain giants becoming demons, explaining how evil persisted in the post-Diluvian world despite the destruction of the giants themselves. According to Jubilees, 1/10 of these demons were allowed to remain active under the leadership of Mastema, their prince, to test and accuse humanity until the final judgment, while the remainder were bound in places of punishment to await their ultimate fate. Second Enoch, a later apocalypse preserved primarily in Slavonic, contained different traditions about Enoch's ascent through multiple levels of heaven, his transformation into an angelic being, his installation as a celestial scribe. Though it did not focus extensively on the Watchers and Giants, it shared the broader framework of a cosmos populated by various orders of angels and demons, of hidden knowledge revealed to chosen prophets, of imminent judgment, and the division of humanity into the saved and the damned. Third Enoch, a still later work from the early medieval period, presented Enoch transformed into the angel Metatron, the highest of created beings, standing closest to the divine throne. These later developments demonstrated how the figure of Enoch continued to accumulate traditions and significance, becoming a vehicle for increasingly elaborate angelologies and cosmologies, a patron of mysticism and esoteric knowledge. Early Christianity inherited this Enochic tradition and struggled with how to incorporate it into the emerging Christian canon and theology. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament directly quoted from 1st Enoch, referring to Enoch's prophecy about the coming of the Lord with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment, thereby granting the text a degree of authority within apostolic literature. The second epistle of Peter, which many scholars believe drew on Jude or shared sources with it, also referenced the fallen angels, though without naming Enoch explicitly. These canonical allusions ensured that Christian readers would be familiar with the basic outline of the Watcher mythology, even if they did not have access to the full texts, even if the Church eventually decided not to include 1st Enoch or the Book of Giants in the biblical canon accepted by most Christian traditions. The reasons for the eventual exclusion of the Enochic literature from most Christian and Jewish canons were complex and multifaceted. For Rabbinic Judaism, which emerged in the centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple, the emphasis shifted away from apocalyptic speculation toward legal interpretation and communal survival, toward the development of the Mishnah and Talmud, bodies of oral law and rabbinic commentary that would define Jewish identity in the absence of temple and homeland. The wild visions of apocalyptic texts, their emphasis on angelic hierarchies and cosmic warfare, fit less comfortably in this new framework than did the careful parsing of biblical law and the application of traditional wisdom to contemporary questions. The Enochic literature was not officially condemned, but was quietly allowed to fade from circulation, preserved only in citations and references in other works. For Christianity, the question of the Enochic texts became caught up in broader debates about canon and authority, about which books should be read in church, which texts contained inspired teaching, which writings were apostolic or directly derived from apostolic witness. First Enoch's survival in Ethiopia, where it was never questioned as scripture, demonstrated that different branches of the church made different decisions about these matters, that canon was not uniform across all Christian communities. The Book of Giants, lacking even the Ethiopian preservation that kept 1st Enoch alive, disappeared almost completely from Christian consciousness, surviving only in the Manichaean adaptations that had transformed it beyond recognition for Christian readers. Only the discovery at Qumran would restore the Book of Giants to awareness, and even then, only within scholarly circles, for it never achieved the popular recognition or accessibility of the biblical texts or even of the more complete Book of Enoch. The fragments that survived, weathered and incomplete, carried within them not only a specific narrative about giants and judgment, but also the traces of a much larger world of thought and imagination, a theological ecosystem in which angels and demons, prophets and patriarchs, cosmic battles and divine decrees all interacted in complex patterns. To read these fragments was to glimpse that world, to see how ancient communities made sense of suffering and evil, how they maintained hope in the face of overwhelming power arrayed against them, how they found meaning in stories that connected their present struggles to primordial events and promised future vindication. The Book of Giants, broken though it was, remained a window into that ancient cosmos, a reminder that the questions humans asked about justice and fate, about the origin of evil and the hope for redemption, were not new questions but had been asked and answered in different ways across the long centuries of human reflection on the divine and the demonic, the sacred and the profane, the mortal and the eternal. The fragments of the Book of Giants do not describe the flood itself in any detail that has survived the ravages of time, but the tradition preserved in related texts paints a picture of cosmic catastrophe that swept away not only the giants, but the entire corrupt civilization they had dominated. According to the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, the deluge began when the fountains of the great deep were broken open and the windows of heaven were unsealed, when water poured forth from above and below simultaneously, rising with unstoppable force until it covered the highest mountains, until every living thing that moved upon the face of the earth was drowned, save only those sheltered within the ark that Noah had built according to divine instruction. The giants, for all their strength and stature, could not swim forever, could not climb high enough to escape the rising tide, could not build boats large enough to carry them, or find refuge in caves that would not fill with water and become tombs. The death of the giants was not merely physical, but carried theological significance. For according to the traditions that developed around the Enochic literature, the spirits of the slain giants did not descend to Sheol, the common destination of human souls, but remained upon the earth as demons, disembodied entities driven by the same violent impulses that had characterized their physical existence. The Book of Enoch explained this unusual fate through the mixed nature of the giants, beings born of angels and humans, whose spiritual component derived from their immortal fathers, while their physical bodies came from mortal mothers. When the bodies perished in the flood, the spirits were released, but had nowhere to go, caught between heaven, which rejected them, and the underworld, which was not their proper place, condemned to wander the earth as invisible presences causing harm until the final judgment. This tradition of the giant spirits becoming demons provided an explanation for the persistence of evil in the post-Diluvian world, a theological answer to the question of why the flood, which was supposed to cleanse creation of corruption, did not result in a perfect, renewed world. The Book of Jubilees developed this theme extensively, describing how Noah, after emerging from the ark and establishing himself in a purified earth, soon discovered that demons were still troubling humanity, leading his descendants astray, causing illness and violence. Noah prayed for protection, and in response to his petition, God commanded that 9/10 of the demonic spirits be bound in places of punishment, but allowed 1/10 to remain active under the leadership of Mastema, the chief of demons, to test humanity and to serve as instruments of divine judgment against the wicked. This arrangement explained why temptation and evil continued to exist while maintaining divine control over the cosmos. The fragments from Qumran hint at this tradition but do not develop it fully, suggesting that the Book of Giants, as preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, focused primarily on the pre-flood narrative, on the dreams and fears of the giants while they still lived, rather than on their afterlife as demons. The Manichaean version of the Book of Giants, however, incorporated extensive material about the demonic spirits, weaving them into the elaborate Manichaean mythology of the struggle between light and darkness. In the Manichaean framework, the giant spirits became archons or rulers of the material world, powerful demons who worked to keep souls trapped in matter, preventing their escape to the realm of light. This adaptation demonstrated how the basic story could be reshaped to fit different theological systems while retaining its core elements of angelic rebellion, monstrous offspring, divine judgment, and the ongoing struggle against supernatural evil. The concept of demons as the spirits of dead giants influenced both Jewish and Christian demonology for centuries, appearing in various forms in rabbinic literature, in early Christian writings, in magical texts and exorcism formulas. The Testament of Solomon, a pseudepigraphical work from the early Christian period, described how King Solomon used a magical ring to bind demons and compel them to work on the construction of the temple. And among the demons he interrogated were spirits who claimed to be descended from the giants or to serve the fallen angels. The demons in this text had specific names, specific areas of influence, specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who knew the proper incantations and ritual procedures. This practical demonology, which aimed to give humans power over malevolent spirits, drew on the Enochic tradition while adapting it for new purposes. The early Christian church fathers engaged with the Enochic traditions in various ways, some accepting them as genuine ancient wisdom, others expressing skepticism or outright rejection. Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, writing in the 2nd century, referred to the fallen angels and their giant offspring as historical facts that explained the origin of pagan gods, arguing that the demons worshipped by Greeks and Romans were actually the spirits of the giants. That idol worship was therefore the veneration of evil beings rather than genuine divinities. This apologetic use of the Watcher mythology served to discredit pagan religion while affirming the superiority of Christian monotheism, which recognized these beings for what they truly were and refused to honor them. Other church fathers, including Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, cited the Book of Enoch with approval, treating it as ancient scripture that provided valuable insight into the spiritual world and the history of humanity before the flood. Tertullian defended the authenticity of the Book of Enoch by arguing that Noah, who survived the flood, would have preserved knowledge of Enoch's writings and passed them down to future generations, ensuring their transmission despite the destruction of the antediluvian world. He also noted that Enoch's prophecy about the coming judgment, quoted in the Epistle of Jude, confirmed the text's inspired status and its relevance for Christian teaching. Clement incorporated Enochic traditions into his allegorical interpretations of Scripture, seeing in the story of the Watchers and Giants patterns of spiritual truth that applied to the ongoing struggle between virtue and vice in the Christian life. However, as Christianity became more institutionalized and more concerned with establishing precise boundaries of orthodoxy, the status of the Enochic literature became increasingly problematic. Church councils, seeking to define which books should be read in worship and which should be relegated to private study or excluded altogether, generally did not include 1st Enoch or related texts in their canonical lists, with the notable exception of the Ethiopian Church, which maintained the Book of Enoch as fully scriptural. The reasons for this exclusion were partly theological, concerns about the text's elaborate angelology and its suggestion that angels could permanently fall from grace, and partly practical, the lack of apostolic authorship or clear connection to the authoritative tradition of the Church. By the medieval period in Western Christianity, the Book of Enoch was known only through quotations and references, the full text having disappeared from circulation in Greek and Latin. The tradition of the giants and their demonic afterlife found new expression in medieval Jewish mysticism, particularly in the development of Kabbalah, which drew on ancient apocalyptic and esoteric sources to construct complex systems of divine emanations, angelic hierarchies, and demonic powers. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalistic thought, contained references to the Watchers and their offspring, interpreting them as symbols of spiritual forces that had broken free from divine control, that represented the Sitra Achra, the other side, the realm of evil and impurity that existed in opposition to holiness. The giants in this mystical framework were not merely historical beings, but archetypes of the unredeemed aspects of creation, powers that would only be fully vanquished in the Messianic age, when God would destroy death itself and evil would be eradicated from existence. Islamic tradition also preserved echoes of the Watcher mythology, though in forms significantly altered from the Jewish and Christian versions. The Quran itself did not tell the story of fallen angels taking human wives, but later Islamic commentators and storytellers developed traditions about beings called jinn, created from smokeless fire, who lived on earth before humanity, and who sometimes interacted with humans in ways both beneficial and harmful. Some Islamic scholars connected these jinn traditions with the biblical and extra-biblical stories about giants and pre-flood corruption, creating hybrid narratives that combined Quranic material with legends derived from Jewish and Christian sources. The prophet Idris, identified in Islamic tradition with the biblical Enoch, became a figure of great wisdom who ascended to heaven and received divine knowledge, though the specific details of the Watcher rebellion were generally downplayed or reinterpreted in ways that preserved the Islamic emphasis on angelic obedience. Throughout all these transmissions and transformations, the basic narrative pattern persisted: angels or supernatural beings who violated boundaries, offspring born from forbidden unions, a world corrupted by violence and illicit knowledge, divine judgment through flood, and the continuation of evil in new forms. The story served different purposes in different contexts, explaining the origin of demons in one setting, providing allegorical warnings about spiritual dangers in another, offering historical examples of divine justice and the consequences of transgression in yet another. Its adaptability and its resonance with fundamental human concerns about the problem of evil, about the limits of knowledge, about divine justice and human suffering allowed it to survive and be retold across cultures and centuries, despite the loss of many original texts. The theological sophistication of the Enochic tradition, including the Book of Giants, should not be underestimated. These were not primitive myths or simple folk tales, but carefully constructed narratives that engaged with profound questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds, the origins of corruption, and the grounds for hope in a world dominated by powerful forces hostile to human flourishing. The authors and tradents of these texts were wrestling with the same issues that would occupy theologians and philosophers for millennia, developing their own answers within the framework of ancient Near Eastern cosmology and apocalyptic expectation, creating literature that was both culturally specific and universally relevant, rooted in particular historical circumstances, yet addressing timeless concerns. The giants themselves, as characters in this theological drama, functioned on multiple levels simultaneously. They were literal beings in the narrative, enormous and powerful, violent and doomed, but they were also symbols of hubris and excess, of what happens when natural boundaries are transgressed, when power is exercised without restraint, when the strong prey upon the weak without accountability. Their dreams, which troubled them and drove them to seek interpretation, represented the working of conscience, the internal voice that knows guilt even when external circumstances might suggest triumph. Their doom, decreed before they could repent, raised questions about justice and mercy, that the texts addressed by emphasizing the collective nature of their corruption, the impossibility of their continued existence in a created order that had been designed for harmony and balance, the necessity of their removal for the survival of humanity itself. The flood, in this framework, was not arbitrary divine wrath, but surgical intervention, the excision of a cancer that threatened to consume the entire body of creation. Noah and his family represented the preservation of human potential, the maintenance of a seed from which a new and better civilization might grow, though the continued presence of demonic influences ensured that the struggle between good and evil would continue, that each generation would face its own tests and make its own choices. The story of the giants thus served as both warning and encouragement, warning against the pursuit of forbidden knowledge and the transgression of natural limits, encouragement that evil, no matter how powerful it might appear, was ultimately subject to divine judgment and would not have the final word in the unfolding of history. In the silent caves at Qumran, where the fragments of the Book of Giants rested in their sealed jars through the long centuries, these theological truths waited to be rediscovered. Their words faded, but their message enduring. The scribes who had copied them had believed they were preserving essential wisdom for future generations, knowledge that would be needed when the final crisis came, when God intervened once more to judge the world and establish righteousness. They could not have imagined that 2,000 years would pass before their library would be found, that the world they knew would be swept away as thoroughly as the antediluvian civilization they wrote about, that the very language in which they worked would become a scholarly specialty studied by a handful of experts. Yet in the preservation of the texts, in the survival of the fragments, their purpose was fulfilled across a gulf of time vaster than they could have conceived, speaking to readers in a world they never imagined, carrying forward questions and insights that remained relevant despite all the changes in human understanding and circumstance. The discovery of the Book of Giants among the Dead Sea Scrolls fundamentally altered scholarly understanding of Second Temple Judaism, revealing a religious landscape far more diverse and complex than had been previously imagined. Before Qumran, the period between the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the Second Temple had been viewed largely through the lens of Rabbinic Judaism, which had survived and flourished after 70 of the Common Era, and through the New Testament, which preserved a Christian perspective on first-century Jewish life and thought. The Qumran library demonstrated that these two sources, valuable though they were, represented only a portion of the Jewish religious experience in this formative period, that other groups with different theologies, different practices, different sacred texts had also existed, had also claimed to represent authentic Judaism, had also shaped the religious imagination of their time. The presence of apocalyptic texts like the Book of Giants in the Qumran library challenged earlier assumptions that apocalyptic thought was a marginal or aberrant development within Judaism, a temporary enthusiasm that arose in response to foreign oppression and faded when more rational forms of religious expression prevailed. The carefully copied manuscripts, the multiple versions of texts, the integration of apocalyptic material with legal and liturgical documents all suggested that for the Qumran community, and presumably for other groups who shared similar outlooks, apocalyptic revelation was not marginal but central, not aberrant but essential to understanding God's purposes and humanity's place in the cosmic order. The visions of heavenly tablets and angelic warfare, the expectations of imminent judgment, the detailed mythologies of the antediluvian world. These were not peripheral curiosities, but core elements of a coherent worldview that made sense of present suffering and sustained hope for future vindication. Scholars studying the fragments faced numerous challenges beyond the simple physical difficulty of reading damaged parchment. The texts were written in a religious and cultural context separated from the modern world by 2 millennia and multiple paradigm shifts, requiring interpreters to reconstruct not only the language but the entire conceptual framework within which these works had been composed and understood. Words that appeared straightforward in their basic meaning could carry connotations and associations that were not immediately obvious, that required extensive knowledge of parallel texts, of biblical allusions, of cultural practices and beliefs. The fragmentary preservation made it difficult to determine context, to know whether a particular passage was meant literally or metaphorically, to understand how different sections related to one another, to distinguish between what the original author had written and what later editors or copyists might have added or modified. The debate over how to interpret the Book of Giants reflected broader scholarly disagreements about the nature and purpose of apocalyptic literature in general. Some scholars emphasized the historical and political dimensions, arguing that texts like the Book of Giants encoded references to contemporary events in symbolic language, that the stories of giants and judgment served as veiled commentary on oppressive empires and corrupt religious authorities, that readers in the Second Temple period would have understood the giants as standing for specific groups or powers in their own time. Other scholars focused on the mythological and cosmic aspects, seeing the texts as explorations of fundamental questions about the origin of evil and the structure of reality, as speculative theology rather than political allegory, as attempts to map the invisible spiritual world that lay behind and beneath the visible physical world. Still other interpreters approached the Book of Giants from literary and anthropological perspectives, analyzing its narrative structures, its use of dreams and visions as storytelling devices, its development of character and theme. From this angle, the giants emerged as tragic figures, beings caught in circumstances not of their making, aware of their own monstrosity, but unable to transcend it, seeking knowledge and understanding, but finding only confirmation of their doom. The dreams that haunted them functioned as a kind of dramatic irony, revealing to readers what the characters themselves struggled to comprehend, creating tension between what was known and what remained hidden, between fate decreed and fate experienced. The journey of Mahaway to consult Enoch structured the narrative with quest-like elements, a hero seeking a boon from a wise figure, though in this case the boon turned out to be knowledge too terrible to be welcomed. The relationship between the Qumran fragments and the Manichaean versions continued to generate scholarly discussion and disagreement. The extent of Manichaean adaptation raised questions about how to use the later material in reconstructing the earlier Jewish text, whether the Manichaean additions could be reliably distinguished from the original narrative, whether the very different theological frameworks of the two traditions had resulted in fundamental transformations that made the Manichaean version unreliable as a witness to the Qumran text. Some scholars were confident in their ability to identify and strip away Manichaean elements, revealing the Jewish substrate beneath. Others were more cautious, arguing that the process of transmission and adaptation had been so thorough that the two versions should be treated as essentially separate works, both drawing on common traditions, but each shaped by its own context and concerns. The physical preservation of the fragments themselves became an increasingly urgent concern as the 21st century progressed. The scrolls that had survived for 2,000 years in the stable environment of sealed jars in dry caves now faced new threats from exposure to light, air, and handling, from the microscopic organisms that fed on organic materials, from the chemical processes that slowly degraded the parchment and faded the ink. Conservation specialists worked to develop methods for stabilizing the fragments, for protecting them from further deterioration while still allowing them to be studied and photographed. Some fragments were placed between sheets of specially treated glass, creating a protective environment that allowed viewing without direct contact. Others were digitally photographed under various lighting conditions, creating high-resolution images that could be studied without exposing the originals to additional handling. The question of access to the fragments and to the images made from them evolved over the decades following the initial discovery. In the early years, a small team of scholars controlled the material, working slowly through the vast collection, publishing articles and monographs at a pace that frustrated those who were excluded from direct examination of the texts. Critics argued that such important historical documents should be made available to the entire scholarly community, that the monopoly exercised by the initial team delayed understanding and limited the range of interpretive approaches that could be brought to bear on the material. Eventually, through a combination of pressure from the broader academic world and the availability of new technologies for imaging and sharing, the bulk of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the fragments of the Book of Giants, became accessible to researchers worldwide, photographed and catalogued, and placed in digital databases that could be searched and studied remotely. This democratization of access led to an explosion of scholarship as researchers from diverse backgrounds and with different methodological commitments began working with the texts. New readings were proposed for damaged passages, alternative arrangements of fragments were suggested, connections to other ancient literature were discovered and debated. The scholarly conversation became more international and more interdisciplinary, incorporating insights from linguistics and archaeology, from computer-aided textual analysis and material science, from comparative religion and cultural anthropology. The Book of Giants, along with the other Qumran texts, became a testing ground for various approaches to understanding ancient religion, a body of material rich enough and complex enough to support multiple interpretations, resistant to any single explanatory framework. The fragments also attracted attention beyond the academy, capturing the imagination of religious communities and the general public interested in ancient mysteries and lost knowledge. Popular books and documentaries explored the Dead Sea Scrolls, often emphasizing their age and their discovery narrative, the shepherd and the cave, the jars sealed for 2 millennia. The Book of Giants, with its dramatic content and its connection to the enigmatic Nephilim mentioned briefly in Genesis, became a subject of particular fascination for those interested in biblical interpretation, in alternative religious histories, in the boundaries between canonical and apocryphal literature. Some religious groups incorporated insights from the Qumran texts into their own teachings, seeing in the apocalyptic worldview of the community a model for contemporary faith and practice. Others viewed the texts primarily as historical curiosities, interesting for what they revealed about ancient beliefs, but not authoritative for modern religious life. The interpretive debates extended to questions about the relationship between the Qumran community and early Christianity. Some scholars noted parallels between Qumran theology and certain aspects of New Testament thought, the emphasis on dualism and cosmic battle, the expectation of imminent judgment, the formation of a community understood as a remnant chosen by God, the practice of communal meals and ritual purification. These similarities led to speculation about possible historical connections, whether John the Baptist might have had contact with the Qumran community, whether Jesus or his earliest followers might have been influenced by Essene teachings, whether the Qumran texts provided insight into the Jewish context from which Christianity emerged. Other scholars cautioned against overstating these connections, pointing out that apocalyptic and sectarian movements were widespread in Second Temple Judaism, that similar ideas could develop independently in different groups, that the differences between Qumran and early Christianity were at least as significant as the similarities. The Book of Giants specifically contributed to understanding of how different Jewish groups in the Second Temple period thought about evil and redemption, about the spirit world and its interaction with human affairs, about the interpretation of sacred texts and the role of prophetic revelation. The fragments demonstrated that the brief references to the Nephilim in Genesis and to the fallen angels in other biblical passages were understood by at least some Jews as keys to understanding the human condition, as foundational narratives that explained not only ancient history but present reality. The elaborate development of these themes in texts like the Book of Giants showed a community actively engaged in theological reflection, not simply preserving tradition, but creatively interpreting it, expanding upon it, drawing out implications and applications that were not explicit in the biblical text itself. Modern theological and ethical discussions have occasionally drawn on the Watcher mythology and the story of the giants to explore questions about boundaries and transgression, about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without wisdom, about power exercised without moral restraint. Environmental ethicists have pointed to the giants' consumption of resources and their corruption of the natural world as ancient warnings about ecological destruction. Bioethicists have noted the theme of forbidden mixing, of boundary violations between distinct orders of being, as relevant to contemporary debates about genetic engineering and the modification of human nature. These modern applications, while perhaps not what the ancient authors intended, demonstrate the enduring capacity of these narratives to speak to fundamental human concerns about limits and consequences, about the proper relationship between knowledge and power, about the responsibility that comes with capability. The fragments of the Book of Giants, residing now in climate-controlled vaults, photographed and studied and analysed with tools and techniques undreamed of by the scribes who copied them, continue to guard their mysteries even as they reveal their secrets. Each advance in imaging technology brings new details into visibility, letters that had faded beyond legibility becoming readable once more through multispectral photography or digital enhancement. Each new comparative study with related texts illuminates connections and influences that deepen understanding of the tradition. Each generation of scholars brings fresh questions and perspectives to the material, finding in these ancient words reflections of contemporary concerns, seeing in the dreams of doomed giants patterns that resonate with modern anxieties about power and judgment, about knowledge and its consequences, about the persistence of evil and the hope for its ultimate defeat. The scribes at Qumran, who carefully copied these texts onto prepared parchment, who sealed them in jars and hid them in caves, who performed these acts as the world they knew was collapsing around them, could not have imagined the journey their work would take, the languages it would be translated into, the technologies that would be used to preserve and study it, the global community of scholars who would devote careers to understanding what they had written. They worked in faith that their efforts mattered, that the texts they preserved contained truth worth saving, that future generations would need the wisdom and warnings contained in these ancient stories. In the survival of the fragments, in their rediscovery and study, in the ongoing conversation they have generated among scholars and readers across the world, that faith has been vindicated, though in ways stranger and more circuitous than the scribes could possibly have anticipated in their isolated settlement beside the Dead Sea. In the broader sweep of human religious history, the Book of Giants occupies a peculiar position, a text that was central to certain communities for certain periods, but that ultimately failed to achieve the canonical status that would have ensured its continuous transmission and preservation, unlike the books of the Hebrew Bible, which were copied and recopied through every generation, translated into every major language, studied and memorized, and taught as authoritative scripture. The Book of Giants and its companion apocalyptic texts fell silent, disappearing from the active religious consciousness of most Jewish and Christian communities, surviving only in fragmentary form or in adaptations so transformed as to be barely recognizable. Yet this very marginalization, this movement from center to periphery, reveals something important about how religious traditions develop, about which texts endure and which fade, about the relationship between official canons and the broader landscape of sacred literature from which those canons were selected. The process by which certain texts became canonical, while others were relegated to the Apocrypha or lost entirely, was not a simple matter of theological truth prevailing over error, though that is how it was often portrayed by those who made the decisions. It involved complex negotiations about authority and tradition, about which communities had the power to define orthodoxy, about practical concerns regarding the usefulness of texts for worship and instruction, about whether works fit the emerging consensus about theological essentials. The Book of Giants, with its elaborate mythology of fallen angels and doomed offspring, its emphasis on secret knowledge revealed through dreams and visions, its focus on cosmic warfare and imminent judgment, did not fit easily into the frameworks that ultimately prevailed in Rabbinic Judaism or mainstream Christianity. It was too mythological, too speculative, too concerned with the supernatural realm, and not sufficiently focused on law and ethics in rabbinic terms or on Christ and salvation in Christian terms. Yet the themes the Book of Giants explored, the questions it raised, the narrative patterns it employed, these did not disappear even when the text itself was lost. They persisted in modified forms, in allusions and echoes, in traditions that were preserved even when their original sources were forgotten. The idea that evil had a history, that it entered the world through a specific transgression at a specific time, that it would be judged and ultimately removed at some future point. This basic framework shaped Jewish and Christian eschatology, even among communities that did not preserve the Enochic literature. The concept of demons as fallen angels or as spirits derived from condemned beings influenced demonologies and exorcism practices across centuries and continents. The figure of Enoch as a prophet who ascended to heaven and received divine revelation became a model for mystical experience and visionary literature in multiple traditions. The giants themselves, as literary and theological figures, continued to capture imagination long after the Book of Giants had been forgotten. The brief mention of the Nephilim in Genesis, the statement that there were giants in the earth in those days, remained in the canonical text. And successive generations of interpreters offered explanations for this cryptic reference, some drawing on traditions preserved from the Book of Giants without knowing their source, others developing entirely new interpretations that had no connection to the ancient apocalyptic narratives. Medieval Jewish commentators debated whether the Nephilim were literal giants or symbolized something else, whether they were born before or after the flood, whether their existence had any relevance for understanding contemporary reality. Christian interpreters likewise puzzled over the passage, some accepting the fallen angel interpretation, others preferring to read the sons of God as descendants of Seth and the daughters of men as descendants of Cain, a reading that avoided the troubling implications of angelic sexuality. In folk tradition and popular culture, giants occupied an ambiguous space, sometimes portrayed as villains to be vanquished by heroes, sometimes as primordial beings associated with the shaping of the landscape, the creation of mountains and valleys, the establishment of ancient monuments whose origins were lost to memory. Stories of giant slaying, from David and Goliath to Jack and the Beanstalk, drew on deep archetypal patterns that may have been reinforced by traditions about the antediluvian giants, even when the tellers and hearers of these stories had no conscious knowledge of the Book of Giants or the Book of Enoch. The image of enormous beings who once walked the earth, who were stronger than humans but ultimately defeated and destroyed, resonated across cultures and epochs, suggesting that the basic pattern spoke to something fundamental in human psychology. Perhaps the experience of confronting powers greater than oneself, perhaps the satisfaction of seeing the mighty brought low, perhaps the reassurance that no matter how overwhelming evil might appear, it could be overcome. The rediscovery of the Book of Giants through the Dead Sea Scrolls allowed modern readers to encounter the tradition in something closer to its original form, to see how ancient communities actually told these stories, what details they emphasized, what theological purposes they served. The fragments revealed a narrative more nuanced than later summaries had suggested. Giants who were not merely monsters, but tragic figures, doomed beings aware of their fate and seeking understanding even as destruction approached. The dreams that haunted them, the consultation with Enoch, the pronouncement of inevitable judgment, these elements created a story arc that moved from ignorance to knowledge, from false hope to acceptance, from life to extinction, a trajectory that paralleled the human confrontation with mortality and the search for meaning in the face of inevitable death. The text also revealed how communities in crisis thought about divine justice and human suffering, how they explained the presence of evil without compromising their commitment to monotheism and divine goodness. The Watcher mythology provided a narrative framework that located the origin of corruption outside the initial creative act, that preserved God's innocence while acknowledging the reality of a fallen and violent world. It explained why the world required periodic purging, why judgment was necessary, why the righteous should not despair when surrounded by wickedness. For the doom of the wicked was already decreed, already visible to those with prophetic sight, already approaching like rising floodwaters that would sweep away everything corrupt and leave only a cleansed remnant. This theological function, this provision of hope and explanation in difficult circumstances, may have been more important to the ancient communities than the literal historical accuracy of the narrative. Modern readers approaching the Book of Giants bring their own questions and concerns, reading the text through lenses shaped by very different worldviews and experiences. Some are drawn to it as evidence of ancient beliefs in supernatural beings, as documentation of how pre-scientific cultures understood the world and its invisible inhabitants. Others see in it psychological depth, the projection of human fears and desires onto cosmic screens, the externalization of internal struggles in the form of angelic rebellions and demonic influences. Still others approach it as literature, appreciating its narrative craft, its use of dreams and prophecy, its development of character and theme within the constraints of a fragmentary and damaged text. Each approach illuminates different aspects of the material, reveals different layers of meaning, demonstrates the richness of these ancient compositions. The question of what was lost when the Book of Giants ceased to be actively transmitted within Jewish and Christian communities is difficult to answer, but worth contemplating. Certainly, the theological imagination was constrained by the narrowing of the canon, by the exclusion of texts that offered alternative perspectives on fundamental questions. The elaborate angelology and demonology of the Enochic tradition, which had influenced so much of Second Temple thought, faded from official discourse, persisting only in marginal or esoteric circles, occasionally surfacing in mystical movements or apocalyptic enthusiasms, but never regaining the centrality it had once possessed. The specific narrative of the giants and their dreams was lost, leaving only the bare bones preserved in Genesis, a skeleton that later interpreters would flesh out in various ways, but never with the detail and pathos of the original tradition. Yet perhaps something was also gained in the process of canonization and the marginalization of texts like the Book of Giants. The focusing of religious attention on a smaller set of core texts allowed for deeper exploration of their meanings, for the development of sophisticated interpretive traditions that might not have been possible with a larger and more diverse canon. The rabbinic emphasis on law and the careful parsing of biblical commandments, the Christian focus on the person and work of Christ, and the interpretation of Scripture in light of the gospel. These developments shaped Judaism and Christianity in profound ways that might have been different if apocalyptic speculation had remained central rather than peripheral. The loss of the Book of Giants and similar texts forced communities to grapple with the canonical texts they retained, to find in Genesis and the prophets and the Psalms resources sufficient for understanding evil and judgment, suffering and hope, without recourse to the elaborate mythologies that had once seemed essential. The fragments that survived at Qumran thus serve as witnesses to a path not taken, to possibilities that existed in ancient Judaism but were ultimately not developed in the forms of Judaism and Christianity that became dominant. They show that the religious landscape of the Second Temple period was more diverse than the later canonical texts alone would suggest, that there were vibrant traditions of apocalyptic thought and mythological speculation, that communities found meaning and hope in texts that told of cosmic battles and angelic interventions, of prophetic revelations and imminent judgment. The Book of Giants, broken and incomplete though it is, preserves a voice from that ancient conversation, a voice that speaks of giants who dreamed and feared, who sought understanding in the face of doom, who died in a flood that was both ending and beginning, destruction and renewal, judgment and promise. In the silence of the caves where the scrolls rested, In the darkness that preserved them from light and decay, the words waited, patient as stone, enduring as the cliffs that surrounded them. The leather grew brittle. The ink faded to brown shadows. The edges crumbled where they had been folded or torn, but the essential patterns remained, the shapes of letters that could still be read, the traces of sentences that could still be puzzled out, the fragments of a story that could still be told. When the shepherd's stone broke the silence and the jars were opened and the scrolls were brought out into light again, the words spoke once more, not with the authority they had possessed for the Qumran community, not as living scripture that shaped daily life and sustained hope for divine intervention, but as historical testimony, as witness to how ancient communities understood their world and their place within it. The scholars who studied the fragments, who learned Aramaic and Hebrew, who mastered the paleography of ancient scripts, who compared manuscripts and debated readings, who published editions and wrote commentaries, these modern scribes were themselves participating in the transmission of tradition, ensuring that the voices preserved at Qumran would continue to be heard, even if in different contexts and for different purposes than the original authors had intended. The work of preservation and interpretation, of photography and digitization, of translation and explanation, all serve to carry forward the legacy of the ancient texts, to make them accessible to new audiences, to integrate them into the ongoing human conversation about meaning and value, about origins and destinies, about the nature of good and evil, and the hope for ultimate justice. The Book of Giants, in its brokenness and incompleteness, became in some ways more powerful than it might have been if preserved intact, for the gaps and silences invited imagination, required interpretation, left space for readers to participate in the construction of meaning rather than simply receiving it passively. The fragments were like ruins of an ancient temple, enough remaining to suggest the grandeur of what had been, to allow reconstruction in outline if not in detail, but not so complete as to leave nothing to the imagination. They testified to both the fragility of textual transmission and its remarkable resilience, the way words could survive millennia of neglect and violence, of decay and destruction, and still speak, still convey meaning, still connect the past to the present across a gulf of time that seemed absolute, but was bridged by the simple fact of writing, of marks on parchment that endured long after the hands that made them had returned to dust. We return now to where we began, to the limestone caves overlooking the Dead Sea, to the jars that stood sealed in darkness for 2,000 years, to the fragments of parchment inscribed with words about giants who dreamed of their destruction, and prophets who interpreted those dreams without mercy or consolation. The physical journey of these texts, from the hands of scribes working in the final years before catastrophe, to the hands of scholars working in climate-controlled laboratories, represents a vast arc of time and transformation, a story of survival against overwhelming odds, of preservation through accident and intention, of rediscovery that returned voices from silence to speech. In the spaces between what survived and what was lost, in the gaps where the parchment crumbled and the ink faded, there rests a kind of eloquence, a testimony to the fragility of all human works and the persistence of meaning despite that fragility. The caves themselves remain, carved by water and wind over geological ages, chambers where light enters only at certain angles and certain times of day, where the temperature stays relatively constant regardless of the season, where bats still roost in the high crevices and dust still settles in drifts on the uneven floors. The jars that contained the scrolls have been removed to museums, cleaned and catalogued, displayed behind glass with explanatory labels. The fragments of the scrolls themselves rest in vaults, separated from one another by archival folders, photographed and digitized, accessible now to researchers around the world through computer screens rather than through direct handling of the brittle leather. The physical pilgrimage to Qumran that was once necessary to study these texts has been replaced by virtual journeys through databases and digital archives, though the site itself still draws visitors who come to see where the discovery was made, to stand where the community once stood, to look out over the same desolate landscape they looked upon. The land around Qumran bears the marks of habitation and abandonment, the ruins of the settlement partially excavated and stabilized, walls rising to waist height or shoulder height in some places, foundations traced in others, a few rooms reconstructed to give visitors a sense of the original layout. The ritual baths remain, stepped pools carved into the bedrock, dry now except when winter rains fill them temporarily before the water evaporates in the fierce summer heat. The scriptorium, where the copying was done, is marked by remnants of plastered benches and tables, by the discovery of inkwells, by the careful analysis of spaces and their probable functions. The cemetery lies to the east, rows of graves aligned north to south, simple burials without elaborate markers, the bones of men who lived and died in this isolated place, whose names are not recorded but whose work survives in the texts they copied. Standing at Qumran in the present, looking toward the caves in the cliffs above, it is possible to imagine the final days of the community, the arrival of rumours about Roman military movements, the decision to hide the library rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands or be destroyed in the conquest. The scribes would have worked quickly but carefully, selecting which text to preserve, wrapping them in linen, lowering them into jars, sealing the mouths with pitch, carrying the heavy vessels up the steep paths to the caves, placing them in niches and corners where they would be protected from casual discovery. They may have hoped to return when the danger passed, to retrieve the scrolls and resume their studies, their prayers, their communal life. They did not return, or if they did, they found the settlement destroyed, the community scattered or killed, and they left the scrolls where they had placed them, trusting that somehow, in some future they could not imagine, the texts would fulfill their purpose. The Book of Giants, among those hidden texts, carried within its fragmentary narratives a message about the impermanence of power and the certainty of judgment, about beings who seemed invincible but who were swept away when their time came, about dreams that foretold doom and interpretations that offered no escape. For the community that preserved this text, living in expectation of imminent divine intervention, the story of the giants served as both warning and comfort, warning against the transgression of boundaries and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, comfort that evil, no matter how dominant it might appear, was temporary, destined for destruction, already condemned by decrees written on heavenly tablets. They read about the giants gathering in council, troubled by dreams they could not interpret, seeking wisdom from Enoch only to receive confirmation of their worst fears. And they saw in this ancient story a pattern that repeated through history, the wicked troubled by conscience even when outwardly triumphant, the righteous vindicated even when apparently defeated. In time, the community's expectation of imminent judgment faded, as it always does when the expected end does not arrive on schedule, when the wicked continue to prosper and the righteous continue to suffer, when the cosmic battle that was supposed to conclude history in a single decisive victory instead grinds on generation after generation without resolution. The texts they had preserved in hope of immediate relevance became historical documents, witnesses to a particular moment and a particular way of understanding the world. Valuable not because they predicted accurately, but because they testified honestly to the beliefs and hopes of those who copied and studied them. The giants in the text did not represent contemporary enemies who would soon be destroyed, but ancient beings whose story had been told and retold across centuries, whose significance lay not in providing a blueprint for current events, but in exploring timeless questions about evil and judgment, power and vulnerability, knowledge and its limits. The fragments speak in broken sentences, in incomplete thoughts, in words that trail off into silence where the parchment has crumbled. They tell of dreams and visions, of journeys to consult prophets, of interpretations that brought despair rather than hope. They name giants who have no other memorial, Ohia and Hahia, Mahaway, and others whose names are lost in the gaps. They preserve phrases in Aramaic that no longer has native speakers, that must be reconstructed through comparison with related languages, with biblical texts, with inscriptions on pottery and monuments. They testify to a world where angels were real and active, where demons were the spirits of slain monsters, where the history of humanity was understood as a cosmic drama with supernatural protagonists and stakes that extended far beyond the merely political or social. Modern readers, approaching these fragments with the tools and questions of a secular age, must perform acts of imagination to enter into the worldview they represent, to suspend disbelief in the supernatural long enough to appreciate what the texts were doing within their own conceptual frameworks. This does not require accepting the literal truth of fallen angels and antediluvian giants, but does require recognizing that the communities who preserve these stories found in them profound truths about the human condition, about the struggle between good and evil, about the hope for justice in an unjust world. The giants dreaming of their destruction spoke to anyone who had felt the weight of guilt or the fear of consequences, who had sought understanding of their situation only to find that understanding brought no relief, who had faced judgment without escape or excuse. The silence of the caves, the darkness in which the scrolls rested for so many centuries, becomes itself a kind of text, a commentary on what endures and what fades, on the difference between preservation and transmission, between survival and vitality. The words on the parchment survived, but the living tradition that had given them meaning, the community that had studied and discussed them, the practices and beliefs that had formed the context for their interpretation, all this was lost, recoverable only partially and tentatively through scholarly reconstruction. The fragments are like messages in bottles, cast into the ocean of time, washing up on distant shores, where no one speaks the language of those who sent them, where the very concepts they employed have become foreign and require extensive explanation. Yet the messages were found, the language was deciphered, and the conversations they preserve about giants and judgment, dreams and prophecy, evil and its origins. These conversations continue in new forms, translated into new vocabularies, addressed to new questions. As night falls over Qumran, as the last light fades from the cliffs and the Dead Sea turns from blue to black to invisible in the darkness, the caves return to the silence they maintained for 2 millennia, a silence broken now only by wind and the occasional call of nocturnal birds, by the settling of stone and the slow work of erosion that continues regardless of human presence or absence. The fragments of the Book of Giants rest elsewhere now, in vaults and databases, but something of them remains in the caves, the memory of their long rest, the impression left by texts that waited in darkness, for eyes that would read them, and minds that would puzzle over their meanings. The giants in the story knew their end was coming, saw it in dreams they could not escape, sought interpretation that only confirmed their doom. They faced extinction with varying degrees of acceptance and defiance, resignation and rage. And then they were gone, leaving only stories, only words inscribed on parchment that itself would nearly perish before being found again. We have wandered through the fragments of this lost text, pausing where the parchment is legible, imagining what might have filled the gaps where it has crumbled, following the narrative as far as it can be traced before it dissolves into silence and speculation. We have seen giants troubled by dreams, seeking wisdom from prophets, receiving pronouncements of inevitable judgment. We have watched scribes copying these words in the final years before catastrophe, hiding them in caves as their world collapsed, preserving them for a future they could not envision. We have followed the long arc from composition through transmission to loss and rediscovery, from living scripture to historical document, from the certainty of ancient belief to the questions of modern scholarship. Through it all, the fragments have endured, speaking across the silence, carrying forward questions that each generation must answer for itself about the nature of evil, the hope for justice, the meaning of existence in the face of mortality. Let your thoughts settle now like dust in those ancient caves, like the fragments resting in their folders, like the words that have travelled so far and waited so long to be read again. The night is deep, the caves are dark, and somewhere in the silence between what is known and what is lost, between what survives and what has perished, the story of the giants and their dreams continues, not as history that can be verified or theology that must be believed, but as part of the great human conversation about beginnings and endings, about the powers that shape our lives and the hope that justice will prevail even when delayed beyond all patience. The fragments remain, broken but eloquent, incomplete but sufficient, testifying to both the fragility of preservation and the stubborn persistence of meaning across the vast expanses of time. Rest now in the knowledge that some things endure, that voices from the deepest past can still be heard, that the silence of the caves has been broken, and the words they guarded have found readers once again, that the long arc of time bends in ways we cannot predict, but that sometimes, against all odds, important things survive.